This is Blue Left, a podcast dedicated to amplifying the underrepresented Democratic voices in Tennessee, working tirelessly to bring progressive change to the volunteer state. Here's your host, Peggy Kingsbury.
That's right. From grassroots organizers to community leaders, from urban centers to rural towns, we'll highlight the diverse perspectives and powerful voices that often go unheard. Join us as we lift up the blue wave and shine a light on the path toward a more inclusive and equitable Tennessee. Again, I'm Peggy Kingsbury, your host, and this is Blue Lift, where every voice matters. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Glad to have you back. And we have a great guest. This is the first guest I've had who is the author of a book, or at least the first one I've had who admits to being the author of a book. A lot of people think they're authors of books. But we have with us Dr. Kevin Riggs today. A lot of you know him as Pastor Kevin, those of you around Franklin. And for those of you not from around Franklin, you're going to really love this interview, and you are going to want to get yourself a copy of the book. Dr. Riggs has been the senior pastor of Franklin Community Church for more than 30 years. He is also the founder and executive director of Franklin Community Development, which we'll talk about. And he also is the founder of Williamson County Homeless Alliance. And all three of those are located here in Franklin, Tennessee, where Blue Lift is headquartered. Pastor Kevin has done so many good things for our community, and he's one of those guys that when you hear his name, everyone says, "Oh, I know Pastor Kevin. He's a great guy." And that is true. That is true. Pastor Kevin shows up at a lot of community events, and he is always fighting for justice. That seems to be the common thread in everything that Pastor Kevin Riggs is about. He is the author of a book, several books, but the book we're going to talk about today is titled Today, the Best Day of My Life. And I will lift that up so everyone can see it. And he has written this in conjunction with another Kevin, and that would be Pastor Kevin Burns. And we're going to talk about who Kevin Burns is and how the two of you came to know each other. But I want to go back a little bit before we get to that. So when I said that everything that you're involved in, really all the North Star, other than your relationship with the Lord, is justice. When did you know, even if you were a small boy, when did you know that justice was something that was important to you?
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me on this podcast. I really appreciate it, and listening to your intro and what you're wanting to do with this podcast is really exciting, because we for sure need to amplify all voices, but especially here in our state, the Democratic Party and those voices that sometimes don't get listened to. And also, my relationship with Jesus and justice are really the same thing. I believe fully that God is a God of justice, but more importantly, He's a God of restorative justice. And so everything that we do is supposed to be reconciliation. God sent Jesus to reconcile the world to Himself, and so then He has given us the ministry of reconciliation. I think back, when I'm young, there's a couple things I can remember. One is the death penalty, that even as a child, when I would hear it, here in Tennessee and it was going on, it made me uncomfortable as a child and as a kid. And then I would go to church and hear how this is what God requires us to do, and then I couldn't figure that out. And so I was like, okay, my adults tell me that this is biblical, but in my soul, it's like there's something not right about this. But then it was probably now going on 20 years ago as a pastor when I was kind of just in a place where I didn't understand why things were working the way they were, and church not growing like it should, all those kind of things. And I remember telling God that the church I pastor is full of good people. They were good people before I became their pastor. If I were to leave, they'd still be good people. And to be quite honest, if they didn't even go to church, they would still be good people. But where is the miracles you see in the New Testament, especially the Book of Acts? Where are the alcoholics and the drug addicts and the prostitutes and people coming out of prison? Where are they? How come they're not in our churches? And God told me, I felt like God said, you need to do a deep dive into the kingdom of God. Now, I'd known about the kingdom of God. I grew up in church, but when He said to do a deep dive in the kingdom of God, and I started really studying it. All these passages of scripture in the Bible that have always been there, but growing up in a conservative religion, just didn't pay any attention to how we're to be caring for the poor and the immigrant and the prisoner and the widow and the orphan and all those things. It's like, well, this has been here all along, but I have had my focus on something else. And so that's really when it started. If you go back a little bit farther, my doctorate is in the social sciences. So for 14 years, I taught sociology at Nashville State Community College, and that there was a wide student body there. And so they started challenging me. They knew I was a pastor, so they would ask me questions to try to trick me, trip me up, and to get off subject. And I think those two things, teaching sociology at a secular college, and then just that deep dive into what is the kingdom of God and what it's about, is where my philosophy really took a turn. That this is about social justice. I'm to use my voice as a pastor to be the conscience of the community, and to use my prophetic voice, if that means anything, to try to speak out on issues that I think are dear to the heart of God.
I love that. And you are the conscience of our community for sure. That's so interesting, the path that you took. And I wasn't going to say this part yet, but you've really just done a magnificent segue. So for the listeners to know, the book that we're going to be discussing some about today is written by Pastor Riggs, and it's written by Kevin Burns, who is an inmate on Tennessee's death row. Yeah. And just to kind of jump ahead real fast because of something that you just said, the relationship between the two of you came about because you went to the prisons and you saw face-to-face men who were on death row. Mm-hmm. And I know in the book you mentioned how that changes things when you have a close personal relationship with someone. Mm-hmm. And it makes it different when you're actually sitting and talking to them. And so when I see all of your work in the community, it all seems to revolve around having a relationship with those who are hurting, who are poor, who are marginalized, who are homeless. Mm-hmm. It's very different when it hits in person, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I say in the book, and it's not original with me, but proximity changes your theology.
Exactly.
And
that's the phrase I wrote down right here.
And so it's really easy to kind of sit outside of something and look and be somewhat judgmental of somebody or be afraid of them because you don't know them.
Right.
But then when you get to know them and you realize, wait a minute, these people have a heart for God, oftentimes just like I do. They're for sure created in the image of God. Everybody's created in the image of God. And so it doesn't matter if it's an ethnic difference or a country difference or a religious difference or a sexuality difference. It really doesn't matter. When you get to know people who are different from you, it changes who you are, and it can be transformational. And so I think eventually you got to relook at what you believe and why you believe it, and then sometimes it changes what you believe because you've met somebody who's in that circumstance. Right.
I mean, getting close to the hurting is the way that we can build, I believe, empathy in our lives.
Yeah. And I mean, I do a lot of work with homeless in the community, and it was kind of the same way. Our church, we don't have a building. We meet in a public school, and then we rented another building to develop a community center in. And it was in a low-income area here in Franklin. But really, at the time, I really didn't know anything about homeless in Franklin. And we moved into this small building, and across the street was a vacant lot, and there were a couple cars there, and they were always there, and there were always people in those cars. And so I walked across the street to start talking with them and found out that they were homeless and they were living in their cars. And it was like, okay, I didn't know there were any homeless in my community, but now I know. And so now what is my responsibility? Now I know that they're here. Now, how do I build a relationship with them? How do I love them? And how do I do what I can to care for them and show them the love of Christ? Right. And so the homeless was the same way. It started out because of proximity to that.
And that's powerful. And I do believe that when we open ourselves up to actually seeing other people and their circumstances, it changes us. But I also believe that sometimes that path is there before us that God has laid, and we work really hard not to walk down that path sometimes.
Yeah.
It's more than just crossing the street when you see a homeless person coming your way, but we work very hard at not seeing people, which is a shame. I wish we worked as hard at seeing them, and putting ourselves in places where people need to be seen.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, the history of the world really is where we're afraid of the other. However you define the other, we're afraid of them. And if we would just meet them and talk with them, we'll realize that, well, we're all human. And we all have the same needs and the same dreams. Yeah,
exactly. I heard someone not too long ago, or I read it somewhere, and it really touched me, and I'd never thought about it. Someone was discussing the difference between, say, a Muslim and a Christian, and they said, well, if you believe that God creates life, where he chose for your DNA to land has a lot to do with your faith. Because if the set of DNA that's in me had landed in Afghanistan and I was born there, it would be a whole different story.
Yes, it would. Yeah.
We Christians get really proud of our Christianity, I think. And, we like to think that, I don't know where those verses are in the Bible about the United States of America. I haven't seen them yet. But that's a lot of people believe they're there because, we are the chosen land.
That's right.
And along with Israel.
That's a whole nother segment.
It's a whole nother segment. But let's talk a little bit about the book, and then we'll talk about some other issues. So your first trip to death row, did you meet Kevin Burns on your very first trip there?
Yeah, and this is in the book, but I'll just go ahead and tell the story. Again, what happened to me, I had been involved off and on in jail and prison ministry pretty much my whole life. I started, in my tradition, you answered a call to preach. And so I answered that call when I was 15 and started preaching when I was 15. And one of the places I preached in was one part of the Williamson County Jail, the workhouse, and it's very low security. And nowadays they're not going to let any 15-year-old into prison. But back then, I went with a man in my church and would preach there. So I've always had this in me of working in prisons, but I had not been to death row, and to be honest, hadn't really even thought about death row because there was a long period of time when there were no executions in Tennessee.
Right.
But I was in my office, I think it was around 2013, and there was an article in the Tennessean that said that there were going to be a number of executions. I always get it confused. It was either, 11 executions in 13 months or 13 executions in 11 months, something like that. And when I read that, I was just like, well, this isn't right. This is not good. And again, in my religious faith, it would be I felt the Spirit of God say to me. And so I felt in my spirit that God was saying, you need to go to death row. And I didn't know where death row was. I mean, I knew it was in Nashville, but I didn't know where it was. I didn't know how to get there. I didn't know anybody who was ministering on death row or anything like that. And so, but convinced that I had heard that from God, I started Googling and just looking for death row ministries in Nashville and came across Tennesseans for an alternative to the death penalty and a Reverend Stacy Rector. And so I just cold called her. I just called her, told her who I was, and I said, this is what I'm feeling. I don't know if and she agreed to meet with me, and then she introduced me to the chaplain at Riverbend, a maximum security unit where death row is. And her name, the chaplain at that time, was Jenny Alexander, and now both of them are dear friends of mine. And so arrangements were made for me to go just to kind of do a one-time visit. And when I went, it was on a Friday at noon, because Friday at noon, back then, a group of men on death row would meet around a table and have a time of prayer. And so I walked into what they call Unit 2A. Unit 2 is death row. Unit 2A is a separate building where there's arts and crafts and a law library, and it's just for the people on death row.
Because they're separated from the general
completely.
Population.
Yeah, they're separated completely. And so they were sitting around a table, about 8 or 9 of them, and Chaplain Jenny Alexander introduced me as, this is Kevin Riggs. He's pastor of Franklin Community Church, and he wanted to come and meet with you guys. And immediately after I said that, a man got up from his chair and came and gave me a big hug, and it was Kevin Burns, and he said, "I've been praying for you," and then it got a little emotional because I didn't know what to expect, but I for sure wasn't expecting to be embraced and accepted right off, from the get-go.
Right.
And so I went a number of times as I worked to get my volunteer badge so I could go, weekly basically. And so when I started going weekly, which would have been around 2014, and KB and I, everybody calls him KB, Kevin Burns. And so KB and I became closer and closer friends. He was the chaplain's assistant on death row. So he had the freedom to walk around and go to all the guys' cells and all the different pods. And he was basically their pastor. And so I did ask him eventually as we got closer to one another, why did you say you were praying for me? You never met me, but yet you said, I've been praying for you. And so then he told me, he said, well, for several months, I've been praying that God would send a senior pastor to death row. We got a lot of great religious volunteers, but we don't have a senior pastor. And I've been praying for that. And so when Jenny said, this is Kevin Riggs, senior pastor at Frank Community Church.
Oh, wow.
Well, then he himself felt like God said, this is the guy you've been praying for. And so it was very natural then for him to say, I've been praying for you because he had been. And then our relationship just kept growing from there.
Well, it's a beautiful story. And so I love the way that the book is laid out. It's both of you writing at different times. And in a couple of cases, you each tell sort of the same story from a different perspective, which is really interesting. And I know that we don't know a whole lot about each other. You may not know that I have a master's in criminal justice, and I'm a former police officer many years ago when I was young and able to do that kind of thing. But so I was really interested in the parts of the book that talk about how KB ended up on death row. And I'm also very interested in social justice issues and the inequities in our what I call injustice system. I usually just call it the criminal injustice system. Yeah. And for listeners who don't know, and you may have heard this, but I just want to make sure everyone understands the situation we're in here in Tennessee. In Tennessee, we have so many people in jail that it is a higher incarceration rate than most other countries on earth. Okay? So not just in the United States. Oh, we blow that out of the water. But most other countries on earth, in fact, all other democratic-styled countries on earth, we have way more percentage incarcerated. And it should be a statewide shame of ours, but it's not. They almost treat it as bragging rights. And as one of our legislators has said, when asked about this problem, well, we'll just build more jails, and he's still there, Cam Sexton. So when we talk about Tennessee and the number of people jailed, we are really talking about a huge number of people compared to everywhere else in the world. And in Tennessee, about 73% of our population are white, non-Hispanic white. And they make up about 55% of our prison inmates, prisons and jails. 16% of our population is black, but they make up 42% of our prisons and jails, getting close to being an even number, actually. So the black population is very much overrated in our prisons and jails. And one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that we have a lot of people in Tennessee that are in jails, in county jails, city jails. So when we talk about inmates, we really mean all of them. Now, actually, in some cases, they are safer and better cared for if they can get into a prison as opposed to a county jail, because county jails can be very poorly run places. They don't have a lot of oversight in many cases. Right. And you can have someone there who simply can't make bail. And they can't make bail because they're poor, they have no job, they can't afford their own attorney, or maybe they do have a job, but it's a minimum wage job, which in Tennessee can just be about 50 cents an hour or something like that. It's not much. And the longer they stay in jail, then they're just more financially deep into having nothing. And so there they stay in jail. And that's not how that should be.
No, it's not. I mean, just this past weekend, I had a parishioner who was pulled over for a traffic violation and was arrested because he had a warrant on him, and he did not know he had a warrant. It was from several years ago. It was a fine that he was supposed to pay because he'd been on probation, hadn't paid it, and didn't even know he had a warrant. And so they took him to jail, and his wife called me, and panicking because of this. And the bail was reasonable. It wasn't a huge amount, so we paid the bail. But and this guy is handicapped in his 60s.
Wow.
And if we would not have paid the bail, his court date was sometime late January.
So he would still be there.
He would be sitting in jail without a charge pending on him because but sitting in jail because he could not make bail, and the bail was less than $500 is what we had to pay. But if he couldn't afford that, and if we couldn't have helped, then from 1st of November or mid-November all the way to the end of January, he would have been sitting in jail for what I'm sure is going to end up being a relatively small amount of money, a small infraction. There was just some type of probation fee that he hadn't paid.
Or it could be a clerical error.
Yeah.
Maybe he didn't owe it.
Yeah, and that's the situation. Now, he didn't have a job because he's on disability, but if you're in prison for a period of time, you lose all your disability.
Right.
And then when you get out, you have to reapply. But there's a lot of people in that same circumstance where they have a job, they get pulled over, maybe they did something wrong over a weekend, got carried away at a party or something, got pulled over, and they can't afford bail, and it's going to be 2 or 3 weeks or a month or so before they go before a judge. And so they're stuck there. So there's a high number of people who are sitting in jail, especially at the county level, who do not have any conviction on them. They're just awaiting trial because they could not afford bail, and then they lose their job, and then they lose their home. They lose,
right.
It snowballs quite.
And they could end up being found not guilty.
They could end up being found not guilty,
and it wouldn't matter.
Yeah, and it really goes back to to what I said at the very beginning. Our criminal legal system is what I usually just say. Just criminal legal system is based entirely on punitive measures.
Yes.
It's just don't do the crime if you can't do the time. And that's not godly. God is a God of restorative justice, and so our system needs to be restorative, both to the individual, to the person who's the victim of the crime, to the community. But how can we practice restorative justice in our legal system instead of just strictly punitive?
Well, and that is exactly right. And also, if punitive justice, if putting people in jail worked, Tennessee should have the lowest
exactly
crime
right.
rate on the face of the earth.
And the United States should have the lowest crime
Yes.
rate as extension. Yes.
But we don't.
We don't. Yes.
So we know it doesn't work, and we're
Yeah.
unwilling to try things that
Yes.
do work. Now, I'm big into causation, criminality causation. That was a big part of what I studied when I was getting my master's degree. Mm-hmm. And we also, I believe, strongly as a society, we refuse to look at those issues and try to solve those issues mm-hmm. to work on the problem from a different angle as well, while we're also giving restorative justice.
Yeah.
We refuse to look at why we can look at a 10-year-old boy and check off a lot of boxes that say, wow, he's probably going to end up in jail. We just don't want to look at that problem.
Yeah.
We're not very good in the United States of looking back about wrongs and trying to fix them, are we? We have big problems with that. Yeah. Well, so in Kevin Burns' particular case, and by the way, I did not get a chance to look up the numbers, and you might know, but there have been a lot of people on death row who have then been found not to have committed the crime that they've been sentenced for.
Yeah, I don't know the exact numbers, but as far as across the country, the number of people on death row it depends on who you read and what studies you follow, is going to be anywhere from 3 to 7%. In some cases, some people say as high as 10%. Of people on death row are innocent of the charges that put them on death row, which means in just a month or so ago, I think it was in Oklahoma, a man was executed who the evidence seemed to strongly suggest he didn't do it, but he was out of appeals and they didn't do anything, and even senators in Oklahoma were calling for the execution to stop, but the
governor wouldn't do
it. So there's a good chance, and I know in our history we have executed innocent people. There was a case in Florida where it was either 2 or 3 African American men were executed. This, I think, it was back in the 30s, and around the 60s, the state exonerated them and made at least a little bit of a show, and were sorry to their family at that time. But it took 30 years after the execution to admit we were wrong.
Wow. Well, there's a great documentary on Frontline, and I always would show that to my students when I taught criminal justice at Columbia State, and I think it's called Death by Fire. Not sure if you've seen that, but it's a Frontline episode, and it is about a man who was put to death.
I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. It is about a man who was put to death and later to be found not guilty, and it was an advancement in science, and we're not talking DNA. We're just talking about he and I don't want to give it away, but he was accused of setting a fire that caused his 2 young children to die, to burn to death. And the current science at the time and the fire inspectors, the science they were using, it looked like he had done that, but then it was shown that no, he did not do that. Yeah. That's not what caused that fire. And it was too late. I mean, he had been executed. Yeah. And so, so we know that it happens, and we know that people who are innocent are being put to death, and we call that murder, And so, when people want to go back to the Bible about the death penalty, I say, well, how about those who were innocent who we put to death, and now have all those people who did that, do they have to be put to death too? I mean, when does it stop?
Yeah.
If you're a purist and you believe that, but, and I also, I think some translations of some things in the Bible are somewhat dubious and driven by man as opposed to the actual Word of God. And so when people want to pull out parts of verses here and there, I'm always quite suspicious of that because they've picked something to justify their thinking about.
Yeah, and at least the way I look at the Bible, I mean, especially in the Old Testament, there's different laws, but you got to kind of look at the Scripture as a whole, and the words of the Bible after the flood, where it says, if you take a life, you got to give your life for that. If that was meant to be for all times and all, then God violated His own law, which God can never do, because David was guilty of murder, but God didn't insist that he would be that he would be killed. Of course, the Apostle Paul, before his Damascus Road experience, and so that wasn't some type of absolute law that's what's got to be done every time, because God can't violate His own character and His own laws. And so, I think if there's another way for justice to be done besides that, then that's the way, that way is restorative justice. And I think Jesus taught us that by forgiving the woman caught in adultery, which was a crime that you could have been executed for.
Correct.
And then, of course, Jesus Himself was executed by the state. And I think if you look at Scripture in its totality, Jesus' death on the cross should have been the last execution that ever took place.
Oh, that's powerful. Yeah. I've never thought about it like that.
Yeah.
So in Kevin Burns' case, just to really simplify things, he was out with a crowd of guys.
Yeah.
They met up with another crowd of guys, and some gunshots were exchanged. Kevin did not fire a gun.
Right.
He did not kill anyone. Right. But we have in Tennessee and in many other states a law, it's called felony murder. So if you are in a group of people and someone commits a murder, it's just as though you did it, whether you did it or not.
That's right.
So, of course, some people, you hear them say, well, you shouldn't be hanging out with those people.
Yeah.
But Kevin Burns says, and I believe him, when he got in that car with them, he did not know that that's what they were going to do.
Right.
It just developed.
It was actually his birthday, and he was in a rap group, and they had just signed a record deal, and he thought they were going on his birthday, they were going to record some music. And they were, but one of the guys said, before we go to the studio, there's something I need to take care of, because somebody in his family, a younger guy, had been had been in a fight a day or two earlier, and so they went to kind of continue the fight, and things got out of hand. 2 people were killed, but what's interesting even then is on Kevin's side of things, there were 6 guys counting Kevin, and and 2 people died. Of the 6 guys who were there, only 3 of the 6 were charged with murder. The other 3 didn't get any charges against them at all. So if you're going to be consistent with felony murder, they should have been charged with the same thing. Only 3 of them were charged with murder. The other 2 who actually did the shooting got life with the possibility of parole, and within the last 3 years, they've both been released from jail. And Kevin was the only one that got the death penalty. And part of that was Kevin made a huge mistake. He was fearful, and he fled to Chicago. And, the crime happened in April, and it was July before the FBI picked him up and brought him back to Tennessee. At Kevin's trial, there was no evidence. A gun wasn't even presented as evidence. There was no evidence whatsoever that he did anything. And so even if you believe felony, now I have problems with the whole idea of felony murder, but even if you believe that felony murder is a correct type of conviction for somebody, you were there, and when a crime was committed, somebody died, you're charged with murder. I can't think of anybody who would think, okay, felony murder should be a death sentence, right, so that you're going to be executed when you did not kill anyone.
Correct.
Even if you're for the death penalty, I don't see how you could be for that.
No.
And that's the situation that he's in.
It is, and it's really shocking when you think about the fact that the other 2 guys who were charged with felony murder were not given the death sentence. They are now out walking around. Mm-hmm. How does someone like Kevin deal with that? Because I would be really bitter.
Yeah, and I would be too. And he and I have talked about that. But he, he recognizes the injustice. But while he was in prison in Chicago waiting to come back to Tennessee, he had his relationship with Christ was recommitted, and Kevin has dreams and visions, and I just take him at his word for that. I know different people feel differently about those things, but that's what he has, and he felt like that before he got the death penalty, and then after he got the death penalty, that God had told him that, look, I have something for you to do there, so don't worry about it. You're not guilty, but I need you there to do some work for me, and when your work is completed, I'll get you out of there. And so he has stuck to that. That in spite of all the injustices, and in spite of the fact that he is innocent, God has a reason for him to be on death row, and when that is fulfilled, he'll get out, and he believes strongly that it's just going to take a word. Like he thinks the powers that be, the governor, whoever, will eventually have a dream where God says, you need to let this guy go, and then he'll be let go. But however it happens, it doesn't matter. But what he's done on death row has really been amazing. I mean, he and I write for Christian Community Development Association. Every year they have a Locked in Solidarity Week where they try to bring attention to mass incarceration. And for several years, he and I have written the sermon and the study guides for churches to use during that week. I go to prison in Honduras, and there's a man in Honduras who is a pastor. And when I go to Honduras, Kevin gives me a letter. I take it to him. Then when I come back, he writes a letter. So he's corresponding with that. Last year, he participated from death row in the October 10th worldwide day against the death penalty. And he was one of the people that had a prayer. And so, I mean, he has had an international ministry from that place. Prison. And then the number of people who have met him, who just locally, and when you meet him, you're not going to forget that you met him. He's so positive. The title of the book comes from his saying, how are you doing, KB? He'll say, today's the best day of my life. And he means it. And so when you meet him one time, you leave a changed person because of your interactions with him. Right. And so, what he has been able to do, and our church ordained him back in 2018. And one of the weeks after I ordained him, I went back to see him, And as we were making our rounds through death row, the guards were saying, "Good morning, Pastor Kevin. How you doing, Pastor Kevin?" And the first 2 or 3 times that happened, I said, "I'm doing fine." But in the back of my mind, I thought, I've been coming out here for years, and these guards had never spoken to me. But then it dawned on me that they weren't talking to me. The guards were calling Kevin Pastor Kevin.
That's amazing.
After the ordination.
That's amazing.
And so that's the respect he has with not just among the other guys on death row, but even with the administration and the guards. They know that this guy is sincere in what he believes, and they respect him.
Well, there's certainly anecdotal evidence for God using someone who's in prison to do amazing things and amazing ministries, and even Martin Luther King Jr. Had a ministry out of jail. So the book is just chock full of wonderful stories. There's some very, very sad stories. There's a suicide of a fellow prisoner in the book that really touched me. And I've listened to another podcast that you did, so I was able to hear his voice because I really wanted to hear his voice. And when you think about what he's doing and the grace with which he's living each day, it's really just incredible. And I know that this is a hard question for you, but what is the timeline? What does he have left? I know that there could be is it clemency that? Yeah,
that's really what we're down. He is out of appeals, and his appeal, he was denied relief is how they say it.
And Justice Sotomayor wrote the opinion on that. And it was beautiful.
Yeah, she wrote the dissenting opinion in favor of him. Yeah, and it was very, very strong.
Yes.
And so he is completely out of appeals. There are no more avenues. The only thing that can happen now is clemency by the governor. And we have started preparations for that. In fact, one of the things that the listeners can do, you can put this in the show notes, but it's easy. If you can just remember, Save Pastor KB. There's a website, there's Twitter, there's all. But if you go to the website, savepastorkb.com, it explains how we're asking people to write letters to Governor Lee right now, asking to give KB clemency. And those letters are being collected by his legal team and will be given to the governor at one time. And so I encourage everyone to do that. That's how you can help. And the best case scenario is that he would get a pardon. That's the best case scenario.
Right.
The second best case scenario was that he would be granted clemency, which means that he would get the same sentence the other guys got,
and have an opportunity.
And with his record, his clean record since he's been incarcerated, getting parole should not be a problem.
How old is he now?
He is early 50s.
And how long has he been in jail?
Well, since 1992. He's been on death row. It was 3 years from the time he was arrested till he actually went on death row. So it'd be around 95 is when he went on death row.
Does he have an execution date?
No, he hasn't. And right now executions are stayed in Tennessee.
Right.
Right now. And
until they figure out the means by which they want to do them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then
it's not because they're not stayed because they've decided they're wrong.
Right.
It's just that the drugs weren't working like they should, so they're trying to come up with Plan B, I guess.
Yeah, and so in actuality, as soon as they started giving death dates again, he could get one. In probability, they have an order because there's been about 8 or 9 guys who were scheduled to be executed, whose executions were stayed first because of COVID, and then because of this mix-up in the drugs, they got stayed again. And so there's probably about a dozen guys. There's 44 men on death row, and there's probably about 12 of them who are out of appeals and awaiting a death date. And KB would be one of those 12. The positive thing is usually you don't start clemency until you get a death date. Now that really sounds sick that you can't even.
It sure does.
Yeah, you have to get a date, and then usually, it'll be all the last minute kind of thing. But our lawyers have been advised to go ahead and start his clemency. And so, that's I try to look at that as a positive. That, wait a minute, somebody has said to go ahead and start the clemency,
right,
even though he doesn't have an actual execution date yet. And so there hasn't been any execution since, the last execution was February 2020. And there hasn't been any more. But when they were stayed because of COVID, there were about 6 or 7 that were scheduled to be executed in 2020. And the first one was in February. That person, Nick Sutton, was executed. And then because of COVID, everything got stayed. And then around 21 or 22, they started them up again, but the first execution was botched. And so they stopped it, and the governor started this process of trying to do a report and everything. So they've all been stayed. And so we're hoping they continue to be stayed.
Right.
But the bad thing about being stayed is everybody, not just KB's, but everybody's cases just kind of become on hold. Nothing's going to be done one way or another. Execution dates aren't going to be set, but the governor's not going to give clemency to anyone. So it's kind of
it's a tough position.
It's a tough position
for him to be in.
And it's tough on his family. I mean, both
Sure
KB's mom and dad are in their 80s, and would love, they still drive up from West Memphis once a month to see him, and when they drive up and back in the same day.
Oh,
and and just that your parents are in their 80s, and you'd like to go home before something happens, and
Well, I really admire the way that you have formed this bond with him, but then also been a real avenue for him getting his word out to the rest of us who can do what we can. And again, go to the website. It is
savepastorkb.com.
There you go. Let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about homeless people in Franklin. For the listeners who don't know, Franklin is the wealthiest city and the wealthiest county in the state of Tennessee. And it's sort of like saying, "Wow, we have homeless people in Beverly Hills." Well, we do. We have them. We have them in Franklin. We have unhoused people. We have people who are insecure with their housing situation, extremely insecure. Some people want to call it couch surfing, but basically they're just at the mercy of their friends to have a place to lay their head and for their children to lay their head. What are we doing about it? And I know that's a big question because we are the king of not in my backyard.
Yeah, we are we are definitely the king of that, and I think more and more people are recognizing that we do have homelessness in Franklin, and still not enough. And so in the city, in the whole county. I came up with these numbers a few years ago, and I still think they're solid because really no one has tried to track it. We're trying to track homelessness now through some different programs that we have. But to me, and I've told the city this and the county leaders and other press, that I think in Franklin or Williamson County, there are as many as 1,500 plus homeless. Some of them, as you said, are couch surfing. Some of them in the rural areas may just be living in a shack. Nobody knows about it, and they don't.
Correct.
And they don't really want. I don't want to say they don't want help, but they're surviving, and that number is based on who we work with, who Grace works with, and then both the county school system and the special school system actually keep track of the number of students who are homeless. And if you put all those numbers together, and then just recognize that whatever those numbers are low.
Right.
Because for example, in Davidson County, the official number of homelessness in Davidson County is somewhere between 6,000 to 8,000 people. But anybody who works with homeless in Davidson County will tell you it's more like 30 or 35,000.
Right.
And so if you put all those numbers together and you come up with 700 or 800 people making the jump, that probably means 1,500 I don't think is too big of a leap to make. And so.
Now, how does a wealthy county like ours deal with that?
Well, they should. In my opinion, they should lead the country in how to do with it. I mean, the county came up with $15 million for an animal shelter, and the county has given me $0 to do anything with homeless. And that's not a criticism to the animal shelter because I love animals, but it's like, okay, somehow or another we can, and you don't have the not my backyard problem with the animal shelter. But you do have it here. And so I think with the resources that we have, there's no need for people to be sleeping on the park benches or in their cars in this particular county. Right now, all that we have for the homeless is we do run an emergency shelter when the temperature is below 32 or above 92, and we do that through local churches. But the other nights of the year when you don't reach that bar, then the people are out on the street. Our offices in Franklin serve as a day shelter. And so that has been a lifesaver to a lot of people. So during the day, Monday through Friday, and this happens every day, people will come in and take a shower, wash their clothes in our offices, see a case manager if they need to, get on the computer to look for jobs. And so that's at least Monday through Friday. But then come the weekends, we're not open and there's no shelter. And Franklin is really being just part of Nashville. Hotels are full more than they're not full.
Correct.
Over the weekends. And hotels are not the solution.
No.
Because no matter how many nights you put somebody in a hotel, the next day they're back where they
they're unhoused again.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so so that's where we are. Now we do have some programs that are grant funded from both HUD and THDA, where we can in a limited basis, because there's always more people than money, but we have permanent supportive housing, where we help people get in and we can keep them there for really an indefinite period of time under certain circumstances. And then rapid rehousing, which really comes into play with what you described, somebody who they've got an eviction notice and they don't know what they're going to do. And it's better to try to keep them housed than to let them become unhoused and find them somewhere else.
Right.
And so rapid rehousing is a pot of money where we can pay so much in arrears to get somebody caught up and so much moving forward to get them back on their feet. And that's usually situational poverty, somebody because of medical reasons or they lost their job. And over a few months, they'll be able to get back to where they were. The hardest part of the homeless population is obviously the chronically homeless. How you move somebody who has been homeless for a long period of time into permanent housing has its challenges, but it's doable. And I think as a community, if we would come together, we could, Franklin brags about being the best at everything. Well, we could be the best at this also.
Yeah, we sure could be.
And be a model for other cities of similar sizes.
And I know the mayor of Franklin is very interested in mental health issues, but that's the area that I think also needs to just really run in tandem.
Well, the biggest problem we see is mental illness. Mental illness is number one. It's bigger than addiction or anything else.
And we just don't have much to offer. I mean,
right.
I've heard people say recently that they have a loved one they're trying to get into a mental health facility, and there are no openings.
There are no openings. No, there's not, and there's not any rehab either, except for maybe one or two 30-day programs, but there's no long-term. And so, I served on a nonprofit called the Recovery Court for a long time, which is a prison diversion program.
Right.
And if somebody needed long-term care, it was East Tennessee, where we sent them here in Williamson County because we don't have it here. And we send them to East Tennessee for long-term rehab things and then come back and then they would go through the program that was set up. But the fact that we're the wealthiest county in Tennessee, top 10 wealthiest counties in the United States, and we don't really have any type of long-term rehabilitation center and we don't really do anything for homeless is just, from my opinion, it's immoral. We got churches on every corner, but yet we can't take care of the people who need our care.
Right. And I know I have a business in Marshall County, and of course, that's definitely not the wealthiest county in the state. Yeah. But they also have some of the same things that you mentioned. So a tiny county like that, that has a high poverty rate, also has a place where people who are unhoused can go for the day. But they also have other things that we don't have here, which says to me it is a crying shame that we don't. They have an organization called Hope Town. I sat on their board for a while. You might be familiar with them. And Hope Town is a place that sort of like what you talk about, like the day shelter, but it's a bit bigger, and it also offers food. They can get a hot meal once a week, and then when you come to Hope Town and get your hot meal, then we pack up a couple of days extra for you and send you home with it, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But we really are not doing right by people in this county. I wish I knew the number. I asked one of my real estate friends, and she said, gosh, I don't know how we'd figure that out. But my theory is in Williamson County, we have probably 4 times as many bedrooms as we do people. Because I know couples who have a 5-bedroom house and all the kids are gone.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of those. There's a lot of those McMansions around Williamson County. Imagine how many bedrooms we have that are not occupied.
Yeah.
It's way more than the number of people who need a place to sleep.
Yeah, and there's solutions to this. It was 10 plus years ago. I had a conversation with one of our mayors. I won't say which one it was, but just with one of our mayors that in our city we have every problem inner city, a big city has, except it's not on the same scale.
True.
And so if we would come together as a community right now, this was 10 plus years ago, and figure out a way to help and to solve these problems, we could solve it in our community. If we don't, 10 years from now, the problem will be so big, we'll never catch up again. And that's about where we are now. The problem has gotten so much bigger, I'm not sure if we could ever catch up again, where we could have put something in place, 10 plus years ago to address these issues and to start talking about it and to start talking about not even affordable housing, but low-income housing, because there's affordable housing in Franklin is a misnomer because it's $275 to $350, and it's only buying a house, it's not renting.
Right.
And there's just no low-income housing in Franklin, with the average one-bedroom being now almost $1,800 a month.
Exactly.
How do you take a person who is homeless, even if you get them a job?
And it's just not the $1,800 a month. They want 3 months down, credit check, blah blah. Just we're pros. We are pros at putting our thumb on people who are already down.
Yeah.
When we use a credit score for so many ridiculous things, even insurance, which I'm involved in. We use it for a lot of things, and we, once people begin to slide backwards, we don't even throw them a rope.
That's exactly right.
We just sort of stand and watch them fall further and further, and then they become other.
Yeah.
And then we don't care.
Yeah, and then we, for sure, as you said earlier, we don't go and try to solve the problems that's causing people to end up in that place.
Correct.
Correct. You go upstream and find out what's happening. What are the circumstances around us that is causing people to become homeless and to lose hope and then to never be able to pull out of that. And when it comes to the homeless, there are a certain amount of homeless in the population that I believe, again, and this comes out of my faith, that as a society we just have to recognize that these people are going to need care the rest of their life. They're
Correct.
They're because of mental issues or disability or whatever it may be. They are not going to be able to be completely self-sufficient. And we need to own that as followers of Jesus and do it. We have churches in our community who will go overseas and build houses.
Yes,
but they won't do anything here. And our church has built houses in Honduras, but we're doing what we can here also.
Correct. We have to do both.
This is
yes.
And in fact, when we were taking trips to Honduras as a church, I would tell people, look, we're here to learn from them so we can take it back and do this same thing back in our own community.
Right.
Not just come down here for a week of vacation and do some good work, but to learn. So now if we're going to help the homeless in Honduras, how do we help the homeless in our own community?
Right. I should have looked up the amount of money it is costing Tennessee every night to keep an innocent man on death row, because I'm pretty sure that amount of money would put an unhoused person on a bed at night.
Yeah, well, generally speaking, from conviction to execution is about $2 million. And so you could literally put somebody in jail for the rest of their life and come nowhere near that amount.
Correct.
But $2 million, and that's because of the appeals process and all that.
Right.
But you don't want to get rid of the appeals process, because then the chances of somebody being innocent being executed rises. And so to me, economically, it would make more sense to put somebody, because they've done something horrible, put somebody in prison for a long period of time, and the family of the victim's never going to forget about that. But the way the system works now, it's $2 million, it's 20-some-odd years between conviction and execution, and every time there's another appeal, the family has to go to the courthouse, and they have to relitigate, and they have to rehear all this. Whereas if it would be, let's get rid of the death penalty, put this person away for life, take that $2 million a year, and you could set up a trust fund for the victim's family to get counseling or for education.
Correct.
Or all kinds of things that you could do better with that $2 million than to just simply, use it for for something that doesn't work anyway. There's no evidence that the death penalty is a deterrent to crime.
No one ever thinks, oh my gosh, if I do this, they may put me on death row. Let me not do this.
Yeah, the only thing the death penalty is it's punitive. That's it. That's the only. There's no restorative value at all.
My point kind of was, we have a lot of innocent people in jail. We have a lot of people who have been in jail plenty long enough now, and they need to be out. The money we're spending on them, we could be using for our unhoused community.
Yes,
so they have a place to lay their head at night, which is just.
Well, let me tell you this, because a lot of people may not know this, but we're working with somebody right now who we've had housed for a while, and we're trying to find them a more permanent situation. But this particular individual was in prison for 35 years, and so he's in his upper 60s. He's only been out for a few years, but because he was in prison for so long and put no money into Social Security, he has 0 Social Security benefits, none, nada, nothing.
Oh wow!
And then there's certain housing programs he cannot get into because of what his crime was. So what are we supposed to do? You let this guy out, and he's in his upper 60s, so the odds of finding a really, really good paying job are low anyway.
Correct.
A lot of housing programs are cut off to him, and there's no Social Security benefits, so no health benefits, nothing. What are you supposed to do with a person like that?
Wow. Well, God's people are supposed to take care of a person like that. That's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah.
We know what we're supposed to do. We just don't often do it. Well, we've been talking for a while, and I guess I'm going to wrap up now. We need to have another conversation later because I want to talk to you about what some of the things are that we may see happening very soon to fellow humans, and how we can do something for them, help that situation. What do we do now? What is our next step? How do we sort of regroup ourselves from the hope we had that some of these things wouldn't come to pass, and how do we deal with that? I'm really touched by the title of the book. Today is the best day of my life, and I will be honest with you. I asked myself when I was reading the book the other night. I said, I wonder. I was about halfway through, and I said, I wonder if Kevin Burns will say that the morning that he may be executed, and I know in my heart that he would. He would still say, today is the best day of my life.
Yeah. Now, Kevin says, today is the best day of my life. The title of the book is Today, the best day of my life. Because if you put today is the best day, there's about 20 other books with that title. So,
okay.
So
today, ... the best day of my life.
And I've had that same thought as you. KB will not talk about that because it's almost like he doesn't believe it's going to happen, and so
I understand that. Yeah.
But I've thought that, and I'm confident that because of his faith, he would still say that.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Where can people find more of Dr. Riggs?
Well, I am on social media. Facebook is just my name, Kevin Riggs. But then Twitter is Pastor4, at Pastor for Justice. TikTok is Pastor for Justice, again, 4. Instagram is Pastor for Justice as well. Our church has a YouTube page where we have our sermons, and at last count, somebody told me the other day there's about 40 some odd sermons of KB on our YouTube page. He will call in sometimes and preach live. Other times he'll record a sermon and we'll just play it. During COVID, when we were virtual, he preached quite a bit.
That's
and
great.
So if you go to Franklin Community Church, the YouTube page, look down, you will find pretty easily. You'll find sermons by Kevin Burns if you want to hear his voice and hear him preach.
Yeah, and I would recommend everyone do that.
Yeah.
And there's also a sermon on there on YouTube that I listened to. And I think it was in 2023, maybe January of 2023, you were talking about some goals for the year. Do you remember that? I think you used the letters of the word, was it life?
I don't.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to that. I'll have to go listen to it.
And I was listening
myself.
to that with the understanding of what we've all just been through and what we are worried about and spending time concerned about. And that was an interesting one. So I would.
Well, this past Sunday, I did what I just call a pastoral talk. So I did a pastoral talk about the 2024 elections, and it's on YouTube now.
Okay. All right.
It's about 35 minutes long.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank the listeners for being here. This is what Blue Lift is all about. Whether you are a person of faith or not, I believe that we've given you a lot to think about vis-a-vis the death penalty and its usefulness in a civilized society. And this is a great book. I'm going to hold it up again. My producer's going to make sure you can see it. You want to get yourself a copy of that. I guess Amazon is a place where you can get it.
Yes.
Yeah. And it'll come to you right away. And if you live near the area, I bet you could probably get Dr. Riggs to sign that for you, which would be kind of cool. So thank you all for being here for Blue Lift. Make sure that you tell your friends about this podcast. If you know someone that would be a great guest for us, just let me know. And also, I want you to rate and review the podcast if you feel so led. We will see you next time on Blue Lift, where every voice matters.